I have seen skeptics claim that Ephraim, son of Joseph, is the same Ephraim mentioned in 1 Chronicles 7. And that's what we're going to talk about today on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. In 1 Chronicles 7, verses 20 to 27, there is a mention of an Ephraim who is living in the land of Canaan. Now, the assertion is made by skeptics that this is the same Ephraim that was born to Joseph, who supposedly died in Egypt hundreds of years earlier. Now, this should be a self-answering question, but being a skeptic these days apparently means that you don't make your first appeal to common sense. So we're going to flesh this out and explain what's going on here in 1 Chronicles 7. And this was precipitated by a certain question. Quote, "Do you happen to have any thoughts on 1 Chronicles 7, 20 to 27, which seems to depict Ephraim and his sons being in Canaan when they should have been living in Egypt at that time," end quote. Okay, the first thing we should do here is read the passage. So we're going to read from 1 Chronicles 7, verses 20 to 27. Quote, "And the sons of Ephraim were Shuthelah and Bered his son, Tahath his son, Eliada his son, Tahath his son, Zabad his son, Shuthelah his son, and Ezer and Eliad, whom the men of Gath who were born in the land killed, because they came down to take their livestock. And their father Ephraim mourned many days, and his relatives came to comfort him. Then he went to his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Beriah, because misfortune had come upon his house. And his daughter was Shirah, who built Lower and Upper Beit Horon, and Uzan Sherah. And Rapha was his son, along with Resheph, Telah his son, Tahan his son, Laden his son, Amihud his son, Elishama his son, Nun his son, and Joshua his son." End quote. Okay, now, prima facie from the account here in 1 Chronicles 7, we can see that this is not the same Ephraim. However, we in the West frequently succumb to a certain literary fallacy. In Western fiction, there is a one-person, one-name rule. So in a fictional story, you cannot reuse the same name because it tends to confuse the reader. However, history doesn't work like fiction. The same names are reused throughout history. This is why we have 11 Ramses, 3 King Charles of England, etc. The Ephraim in 1 Chronicles 7 cannot be the Ephraim from Genesis. They are separated by 300 years of context. And scripture tells us that all of that generation, the sons of Jacob, died in Egypt. So what we have here in 1 Chronicles 7 is the namesake of the tribe of Ephraim. In other words, the Ephraim of 1 Chronicles 7 is the tribal chief who inherited the name of the tribe of Ephraim. But the original questioner has some follow-ups. Quote, "At the end of the genealogy, it mentions Joshua, son of Nun, who at least seems to be the Joshua that led the Canaanite conquest. So if this is a different Ephraim, how does he manage to have Joshua so late in his lineage, and how would his sons be doing things in Canaan before the time of Joshua?" Okay, it's not the same Joshua either, and I can show that it's not. Let's look at the passage. And we'll quote here just from verses 22 to 27. "And their father Ephraim mourned a long time." This is after the death of his original sons. "And his relatives came to comfort him. And he slept with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. So he named him Beriah, because there had been misfortune in his home. His daughter was Shira, who built Lower and Upper Beit Horon and Uz and Shira. His son Rephah, his son Resheph, his son Talah, his son Tahan, his son Ladan, his son Amihud, his son Elishama, his son Nun, and his son Joshua. Okay, now, the question is whether this is a list of Iron Age Ephraim's children or a genealogy that extends back from Bronze Age Ephraim. If it is the former, then Joshua and Nun are just sons of the Ephraim that settled in Canaan and were born after the massacre of Gath. If it is the latter, then Joshua and Nun had to have been born prior to the Exodus, and this is just recounting the genealogy that existed prior to the Israelite conquest. However, that latter view is deeply problematic. First, if the latter were true, then you'd have the Ephraimites settling into Canaan and undergoing the massacre of Gath prior to the birth of Joshua, or his father, Nun, and prior to the Israelite conquest, since Shira was born after the massacre. Second, verses 24 to 27 cannot be read as a genealogy because of verse 25. If this was a genealogy, then verse 25 should read, her son, not his son, since Rephah would have had to have been a direct descendant of Shira, a woman. As such, verses 24 to 27 are not a genealogy, but a list of the Iron Age Ephraim's children: Shira, Rephah, Resheph, Telah, Tahan, Ladan, Amihud, Elishama, Nun, and Joshua. And there's symmetry here. The Gathites killed 9 of Ephraim's sons, verses 20 to 21, and God replaces them with 9 more sons and one particularly infamous daughter. Therefore, this Joshua cannot be the same Joshua that led the Israelite conquest, but was a later Joshua and a later Nun who were born after the massacre by the men of Gath. Now, to this came the response, quote, "Thank you for the insight. One further question then. Someone skeptical of that view could say that it seems oddly coincidental, that there just so happens to be an Ephraim, a Nun, and a Joshua that all aren't the ones we're familiar with. Would it be expected that if the tribe of Ephraim had a famous character named Joshua, son of Nun, in its history, that names like Nun and Joshua would be popular names in that tribe later on?" End quote. People name their children after famous, successful people, not usually after nobodies and losers. People reuse names all the time. It would be tremendously surprising if they never use the names of famous people later on. In the Bible, there are multiple Josephs, Marys, Ephraims, Judahs, Levis, Adonijahs, Abimelechs, and I could continue on with that list of names. There are at least 20 different people named Jesus just in the works of Josephus. Names are recycled. Okay, so I think that covers 1 Chronicles 7 and the case of the double Ephraim. So we have 2 Ephraims, 2 different Ephraims. A Bronze Age Ephraim that was born to Joseph in Egypt, lived his life there, and died. And then we have an Iron Age Ephraim who settled in the tribal holdings of the land of Ephraim, whose 9 children were killed by the Gathites, and they are replaced by 9 more children. And they go on to do very, very successful things in Ephraim. So, I hope you found that interesting. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.